Good afternoon to everyone in the Eastern and Central time zones, and good morning to the rest of you listening in around the country to this webinar that I'm real pleased to be on with you today with the president of the Colson Center, John Stonestreet. My name is Warren Smith, and I'm the vice president of the Colson Center. It's my honor to sort of facilitate the next hour with John to discuss the new book that John has edited with David Dockery called Life, Marriage, and Religious Liberty. What belongs to God? What belongs to Caesar? That subtitle famously comes from the Manhattan Declaration. This book, in fact, is a celebration, a commemoration of the 10-year anniversary of the Manhattan Declaration, which was written by the founder of the Colson Center, Chuck Colson, along with Dr. Robert George and Dr. Timothy George. They were the primary drafters of that document. And this book remembers that process, commemorates the important ideas in that Manhattan Declaration, and also calls us to greater vigilance and diligence in pursuing and promoting the ideas that are in the Manhattan Declaration. John has assembled an amazing array of contributors to this book, and I'm going to let him talk about the book, the process for that book coming together, and the ideas in that book in just a minute. But before I turn the floor over to John, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. We're going to be talking for only about the first half hour, and we want to hear from you for the second half of the hour that we will be together. If you, depending upon the device you're using, if you look either at the top of your screen or to the side of your screen, you'll see a bar that says questions. If you will click on that bar, a field will open up and you can type the questions in there. John and I will see those questions, and we're going to spend the last half hour dealing with just as many of the questions as we can get to. I should remind everybody that we've got about 700 people who have signed up, so we may not get to every single question, but we will absolutely get to as many of them as we can. I also want to let you know how you can get your own copy of this book. For a gift of any size to the Colson Center, we'd be delighted to send you a copy of this new book, this new resource, which we think will be an important addition to your library. To get a copy, just go to breakpoint.org. It's just as simple as that. Go to breakpoint.org, and you'll see a pop-up a banner show up right on the screen that will allow you to click through, find out more information about the book, and to make a donation there, and also give you an opportunity to sign the Manhattan Declaration if you have not signed it. Because even though the Manhattan Declaration is 10 years old and more than 600,000 people have signed the Manhattan Declaration in those 10 years, I'm pleased to report that about 40,000 of those people have signed just within the past year alone. So the Manhattan Declaration is still a lively and relevant document, and helping us really makes sense of life, marriage, and religious liberty here early in the 21st century. So with those housekeeping items, I'd like to turn the floor over to John. John Stonestreet, as I mentioned, is the president of the Colson Center. He worked directly with Chuck Colson in the last few years of Chuck's life, and has been instrumental under John's leadership of sort of carrying on that legacy. With David Dockery, as I mentioned, he assembled a blue chip group of scholars to contribute to this book. He's also the author of many other books, including one that I know many of you know, which is A Practical Guide to Culture. So, John, with that too brief introduction, let me turn the floor over to you and let you tell us what you want about this book, the process, and how you assembled this great group of scholars to contribute to it.
Thanks, Warren. Thanks, everybody, for being on with us today. And let me just reiterate, too, something that Warren said, which is we want this to be a discussion. There's so many contemporarily relevant, like as timely as the news even this morning with coming out of Alabama, which I haven't even actually fully digested, news surrounding life, marriage, and religious liberty. And so there's a lot of contemporary questions happening that are all connected to this line that was drawn in the sand by Chuck Colson, Robert George, and Timothy George. And let me answer the first question that most people have, and that is, no, Dr. Robert George at Princeton and Dr. Timothy George from Beeson are not brothers. They're not related. That's just a coincidence. I know a lot of people ask that right off the bat. Wanted to get that out of the way. No, the three of them actually got together. In fact, in the introduction of the book, Timothy George writes about how the story went. He was on the board of Prison Fellowship at the time, and Chuck came, kind of with an idea. And we used to joke that Chuck Colson had more ideas by noon than the rest of us would have for the next month. And he had just kind of really, I think, dove deep into studying Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the German situation, what was called the Barmen Declaration. And he thought that, in light of the coming challenges, particularly in those three areas, that there needed to be another statement. And so he recruited Timothy and Robbie and then released the statement in a small group. And that was one of the first times that I had the privilege of kind of being in the room with Chuck and connected as kind of the young guy in the room, where he wrote out this statement. And then later on, of course, at the National Press Club, it went on to be signed by 500,000 people. And the story goes on from there. Let me just tell you, though, specifically what we were not trying to do. We were not trying to pat ourselves on the back for the success of the Manhattan Declaration, because what does it mean for a statement like this to be successful? It's a completely, I think, legitimate question to say, look, since the last 10 years, has things gone well on life, marriage, and religious liberty, and to use that as a kind of on a cultural level, and to say, what does that say about the success of the Manhattan Declaration? But I want to be clear about what the purpose of the Manhattan Declaration was 10 years ago and the purpose of this book today. The purpose of the Manhattan Declaration years ago was not to change the culture. It was to clarify for Christians the lines they could not cross. That when it came to these three issues, core issues, and I'll talk about why I think they're core issues in just a second, but when it came to those three issues of life, marriage, and religious liberty, this was a line that had to be drawn. And I think the most important line of the entire document, which kind of sets the theological framework in terms of who we are as created in the image of God, as followers of Jesus living in a trying, challenging cultural moment, is this line, and that close out the document, which says, we will ungrudgingly render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but we can never render to Caesar what belongs to God. And that in and of itself is striking, because when I look at, okay, why then this book? That's the purpose of the Declaration then. Here's where Christians have to stand. These things don't belong to the state. The state can change their mind on these things. Christians can't, because God hasn't changed his mind on it. And our conscience, our thoughts, our mind about these things as individuals and as the church in the world belong to God, not to the state, even if we live in proximity to the state. You fast forward 10 years, and what have we seen? Been wrestling a lot with this heading into 2019. In the years after the Declaration was produced, and there was kind of an organization kind of created around it. David Dockery emerged as the chairman of the board of that organization, kind of responsible for its oversight and helped the transfer of all those intellectual property things to the Colson Center a few years back. And so when David and I were talking about, okay, we're headed into 10 years. What does this look like? What does this mean? What do we want? Warren said in his introduction that this is a book to kind of celebrate the Manhattan Declaration. I mean, that's partially true. It's worth remembering. It was a moment in time, kind of an Ebenezer sort of thing. But we didn't want this book to just kind of be a pat yourselves on the back, look how great it was that 500,000 people signed a document. It was that if these truths about life, marriage, and religious liberty belong to God, then they haven't changed. They still belong to God. And you kind of got to do the math over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, what Caesar was claiming was essentially, and what I mean by that is legally, like officially, what Caesar tried to claim was the beginning of life. You had doctor-assisted suicide in Oregon, so that's the end of life. But other than that, it was pretty much through that horrific decision, Roe v. Wade. Caesar laid claim and said, we're going to claim when life begins, whether you like it or not. And that was the line that Christians, of course, had to position themselves around. But there was certainly, I think, strong indication that same-sex marriage wasn't too far in the rearview mirror. There was certainly indication. Well, it's interesting on the religious liberty issue. I remember thinking, really, religious liberty? Like, this is America. This is 2009. There really hadn't been kind of the significant challenges. But what I think, in particular, Dr. Robbie George and Chuck Colson both understood was the imminent inevitable threat to religious liberty that would be brought by the redefinition of marriage in particular. And that's certainly something that we have seen, isn't it? I was having this conversation just this past week with a couple other religious liberty folks, and we were thinking about, Roe v. Wade, and there's a difference between the Roe v. Wade decision and the Obergefell decision, a couple differences, but one of them is this, is that there haven't been a ton, there's been a few, but there haven't really been a ton of conscience rights cases, controversies surrounding abortion. There's been, whether our tax dollars need to go to support it, there's been kind of insurance questions. There's certainly been questions around an occasional nurse being forced to participate in a procedure, something like that. Those have been really rare, and they've really been kind of quickly settled around employment conscience rights. Go to Obergefell, and we're only a few years into this, and the decision that mandated same-sex marriage, and it has created an enormous amount of religious freedom issues. And so you look at 10 years ago, to kind of go back to where the point that I'm trying to make here, which is 10 years ago, Caesar was claiming life, the beginning of life, and that's it. Let's fast forward 10 years. What's Caesar claiming? Caesar's claiming life. He's claiming marriage and everything that goes along with marriage, parenting, family, participation in family-related ceremonies like weddings. And he's claiming our conscience around these things. So in other words, if it's true that ultimately our conscience on these issues belongs to God, not Caesar, it can be argued that the Manhattan Declaration and at least the principles of the Manhattan Declaration are more essential for Christians to understand and embrace today than they were 10 years ago. Because one of the things when law changes, culture changes. I know we often say around the Colson Center, and it's true that most of the time law is downstream from culture, but law also has a teaching effect on culture. In other words, and it has a normalizing effect. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the clearest example of a group of Americans that weren't really ready for what the civil rights needed to impose on America, but it taught America to get along with it. And that can work in the cause of something good, like civil rights, but can also work in the cause of something bad, like elevating LGBT rights to civil rights. So you put all of this together, and we've got a new context. And so the question of this book that we asked the contributors to answer was not like how great the Manhattan Declaration was, or what did you think about it when it happened back then. Really, we have a chapter in there from Chuck Colson that he wrote at the time. And we have a chapter by Timothy George, who's the Dean of Decent Divinity, one of the original authors, as we mentioned, reflecting on it. But other than that, it is what are the claims around life, marriage, and religious liberty that Christians need to know? What are the things that we have to be clear on? What does it look like to give our conscience to God and not give our conscience to the state on these three issues today? And the contributors did an amazing job. The list is really a who's who, many of whom were part of the original project of the Manhattan Declaration, many, some not. I mean, everyone, I can't even remember all of them. Randy Alcorn, who's written on life just so brilliantly, kind of just makes that fundamental case why life is the greatest human right. Russell Moore and Andrew Walker of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, Trevin Wax of the Lifeway. Johnny Erickson Tata talks specifically about the challenge to those with disability. One of the things that's developed in the last 10 years is that Caesar has not just claimed the beginning of life, but increasingly, and this is a movement marching across the U.S., is claiming the end of life. And what are the rights of those that are incapacitated, that are elderly? When does the choice to die become the duty to die in the case of doctor-assisted death? Johnny writes about that, of course, brilliantly. And then the brilliant Frederica Matthews Green takes on a really important issue, which is why being pro-life is being pro-woman. If you've watched politics at all, you know that abortion rights are equated with women's rights. And Frederica takes that to task as really only she can. Also, Timothy Cardinal Dolan, Rick Warren, Mary Eberstadt, Jennifer Roback Morris, and of course, Ryan Anderson, who's been one of the most articulate defenders of marriage, talk about the issue of marriage. When it comes to religious liberty, Mike Ferris and Kristen Wagoner of the Alliance Defending Freedom, Chad Hatfield Rusty Reno of First Things, Bruce Ashford of Southeastern Seminary, and the kind of the closing word we give to Robbie George. And so you put all that together and you get this framing. Now, I want to answer one more question, Warren. I'll bring you back on, okay? The other question I think is really important is why these three issues and not others. And I actually was able to have this conversation with Chuck back when the Manhattan Declaration came out. And at the time, I remember it was in some elections and talking to young evangelicals in particular and seeing kind of them mentally lay out all the issues. Life, marriage, religious liberty probably wasn't on their radar, but then you kind of add all the other ones, right? Like poverty and racism, sex trafficking, and so on. And they lay it all out. And they would look, and they make their political decisions. They would look at all of them and kind of add it up and say, well, this guy might be wrong on life, and he might be wrong on marriage, but he's kind about, all these other things. So he gets 6 out of 9. So I'm going to go with him. And I explained to Chuck that one of the things that needed to be taught, or I suggested to Chuck, not that he never thought of it, that sounds really crazy. Chuck probably just nodded his head and said, I've already got this in the works. But the real issue was, why are these issues fundamental issues? And here's why. You can't help the poor if you don't know what it means to be human. You cannot help the poor if you do not see family as a foundational element, not only of society, but of the economy. You can't deal with race well if you don't take seriously that abortion has disproportionately targeted poor minorities, the unborn children of poor minorities. You can't get our understanding and relationship with all these societal issues if you don't know what ultimately our conscience belongs to. In other words, life, marriage, and religious liberty, we're talking about the fundamental thing about who we are as humans. We're talking about the fundamental building block of society, which impacts everything else. And we're talking specifically about who we belong to. And the question of who we belong to, whether it's God or the state, whether it's our conscience or our religious belief or the state, that has been at the core of societal conflict since the beginning of civilization. So you got to get those three right. And when you get those three right, it's way easier to get all the other things right. So anyway, that's why those three issues, that's why we wrote this book. The book is astonishing. I think we could also talk, by the way, about other things that we didn't quite get right. Not big, but other things that changed in the last 10 years. It's interesting, for example, on in the Manhattan Declaration, when it talks about marriage and religious freedom, there's not even a mention of transgender. Transgender went from being unthinkable to unquestionable easily in the last 10 years. And it came on a lot faster than the gay rights movement did, kind of hijacked the movement and so on. Now, all this plays out today in everything from the Equality Act to how we think about what counts as a Christian, to what we think about discipleship and baptism, to what we think about our relationship with the larger society. I mean, the list goes on and on and on and on. So these convictions are still really important, and we wanted to clarify those in the form of these essays that are in the book. So anyway, I hope that made a little bit of sense as to kind of what the context here is, why these things matter, what the book can actually add in your understanding of these three issues. And we can certainly get into talking about any of that. We can also talk about really the contemporary issues that are happening in life, marriage, and religious liberty right now, because again, they're not less culturally important. They're more culturally important than even 10 years ago. So thanks, Warren. I'll hand it back over to you. Let's have a conversation.
Yeah, you bet. John, we've already got a few questions in, but let me just remind everybody that if you want to ask a question, we encourage you to do so. There is a field either on the right-hand side, one of the sides of your screen, left or right, or up at the top of your screen, that will allow you to type in the questions. It's a little bar that just says questions. Click on that and a field will open up. And as I said, John, we've already got a few questions, but I wanted to ask a couple before we moved on to the audience questions. One of the things that really struck me as you were reading this list of blue chip contributors to the book, was how in the world did you ever get this group together? Number one, and number two, it also made me realize that was part of the legacy that Chuck left the Colson Center. This convening power, we sometimes call it, ecumenism in the best possible way, not sort of a mushy, compromised ecumenism. Would you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I think the phrase that I like the best, Timothy George, one of the co-authors and contributors, actually coined this, I think, during the time of the Manhattan Declaration. He called it an ecumenism of the trenches. In other words, when you're facing a pretty serious cultural enemy, you find yourself shoulder to shoulder in a foxhole with other people that you wouldn't necessarily, maybe in a generation past you would have been shooting at each other. That doesn't mean the differences are unimportant; they're hugely important. But this was one of Chuck's legacies. I mean, Warren, and when we got the mandate from the board to relaunch the Colson Center separately from Prison Fellowship and build this organization and kind of what was an amicable and really, I think, mutually productive agreement here. We really wrestle with what are the things that we've inherited. And Chuck's ability to call people together was revealed ultimately in the Manhattan Declaration. Just really a stunning movement. When you look at the list of initial signers, people from the left, people from the right, when you look at the number of people who, when we asked, said absolutely here. It was great. Now, the other thing I've got to do, Warren, of course, is give a whole lot of credit to David Dockery. David is one of those rare individuals who has intentionally chosen a life of building institutions of strength rather than just he's as good of a scholar as anyone we know. It's ironic, by the way. I don't want to get into too much church history. You can get me off on a rabbit trail here. But Trinity International University is one of their great all-time presidents, a guy named Kenneth Concert, and he kind of emerged on the scene as a leader at the same time of great names like Carl F.H. Henry and some of the great theological minds of the last generation. And Concert was just as smart as the rest of them, but he intentionally chose that there needed to be a place to build Christian scholarship. And so he didn't put his name on a whole lot of stuff. David Dockery has had a career where he's written prolifically, but he is the preeminent top tier Christian top guru of higher Christian education on the planet. He's widely respected that way. And the fact that he's been willing to work on this project with me was a great honor, not to mention I'm a graduate of Trinity and he's the president. And so that's a great honor as well. But his influence, it can be seen in the number of people that were willing to sign their name and lend their hands and lend their writing to this project. David's just a remarkable guy. And also I would say this too, higher education, and this can be fodder for future questions. Christian higher education is feeling the pinch on religious liberty like very few other institutions. And when we talk about specifically the threat of the Equality Act, which until this year was kind of a non-starter and now has a little bit of more possibility to it in terms, this is a game changer, especially for Christian higher education, not to mention what we've seen in California the last couple of years.
Yeah. Just by the way, David Dockery honored us at the Colson Center some months ago with a series of articles on the state and future of higher education. We'll make sure we link to that whenever we send a follow-up email for this as well. He's a great thinker, and we're honored to have him as part of sort of the solar system of the Colson Center. John, William asked a really great question that I want you to address if you don't mind, and that is the current cultural understanding of religious liberty. William observes that religious liberty was at the center of the thinking of our founding fathers. It was clearly at the center of the thinking of the drafters of the Manhattan Declaration. They included it right up there with life and marriage, and above all the others that, as you said, we've left off. And yet today, in our cultural imagination, we don't seem to think of religious liberty as having that position of primacy. And William's question is, first of all, is that so? And number two, how can we recover that?
It's dreadfully so, William. It's hard to overstate that. In fact, I'm embarrassed because I do remember intentionally thinking to myself, when I was at that first meeting, religious liberty, is that really the same? I mean, we're talking about the unborn. We're talking about marriage. And at that time, religious liberty just seemed to be kind of protecting my own rights and guarding my own turf. Because even at that time, it was easy to say religious liberty is a good and no one argued. You fast forward to today, and if you did a brand study, like Pepsi does, to study like when people see Pepsi, what do they think? And you did that on religious liberty, by and large, a large majority, maybe even a dominant majority, would see religious liberty and hear to themselves, license to discriminate. That means it's not only gone from being a good that we didn't think was actually really a big deal, to being like under attack, but it's now actually a bad word. And this is one of the great threats. And we have these conversations and collaborations and talk about projects that we can do to rebuild and really champion religious liberty. That's one of the questions that always is front and foremost. How do we rebuild the brand of religious liberty? The Barna Group, for example, has done some studies on this just over the last couple years. In terms of, what do people think? And it ranges from people think it's bad to people think it's something so much less than what it is that it's devastating. You might remember years ago, Chuck Colson was the first one to observe that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was using the phrase freedom of worship, not freedom of religion. And what he pointed out at the time is those are two very, very different things. Freedom of worship is the ability to believe what you want in the privacy of your own head, your own home, and your own house of worship. In other words, what they have in Cuba, what they have in China. Like, it's okay. Believe your own fantasies. Just keep it to yourself. Freedom of religion has always been the ability to believe those things in your own head, your own home, and own house of worship. But it's also been the freedom to bring that out into the public square and order your life, including your business, including your deeply held convictions around that you're deeply, order your public life and your public decisions around those deeply held convictions. Doesn't mean that there's no limits. And that's a hard question. Where do you limit religious liberty? And we can talk about that as well. But it actually was something else. So what we're dealing with here, William, and a long way to answer your question is, number one, it's gone from being an assumed good to an assumed bad by a whole lot of people in America. That's a challenging thing. Number two, it's been redefined. That even if it is considered a good, by and large, it's considered to be a personal, private thing, not a public good. This is you see this, by the way, in the trending in the Barna surveys, and I think that's one of the reasons the number of pastors who actually think it's worth talking about, worth defending, has dramatically decreased. And that was Barna's most recent survey. That's an alarming one, by the way. The final thing that I'll say is that, of course, religious freedom, the branding or the cultural reaction to religious liberty has dramatically suffered, is because it has been directly colliding over and over and over with LGBT issues. And there has been obviously a shift where that group, rightly or wrongly, and I would say wrongly in almost every way, has been elevated to the status of the cultural victim. And so by and large, this is one of the devastating things about the Equality Act in particular, is that this legally does what culturally already is here, which is sexual orientation and gender identity gets elevated to the same place as race, which means people who oppose. It literally redefines the Civil Rights Act to include sexual orientation and gender identity at the same level as race, which means people who oppose that, they actually get immediately branded as the KKK and white supremacists. It's inevitable. In other words, if this is the same category as race, then dissenters are the same category as dissenters of race, and you do the math. And so these are really hard branding things to overcome. It's, of the three, religious liberty is probably the hardest thing to argue for culturally.
John,
on a happy note, maybe we have a different question. Yeah.
Well, actually, maybe not. Because Sonia wanted to follow up on the LGBT piece of what you were just saying about it, and observing that not only are there, secular LGBT activists that are aligning against religious liberty and so in marriage, of course, at least a biblical understanding of marriage, but you've got a lot of, progressive Christians in that camp as well. And any thoughts about that, or any response, a way that we can sort of guard ourselves and guard our children? She specifically asked about our children related to this new progressive Christian ideology.
Yeah, the progressive Christian ideology here has advanced in this order. Kindness and care and compassion for a perceived oppressed class. And then I rethink the theology on the tail end. It has not started with a biblical theology of sexuality or a biblical theology of human being or image of God. And so I think one of the problems and one of the reasons that so many children have moved so quickly this direction is that we don't have a strong, robust way of catechizing our children in fundamental doctrines of the faith. You have a repetition way if you come from a more liturgical tradition. Most Sunday schools and sermons and youth groups really, I think, inculcate what we call moralistic therapeutic deism. Christianity makes you a better person, and here's what Christianity can do for you. What's missing in all of this is what Christianity says about reality. Listen, the doctrine of sexuality, or our thinking about sexuality for Jesus, was not an issue of morality. It was an issue of creation first. This is who we are made to be. And so therefore, morality corresponds with nature. And this is something that I think we miss. It's kind of like, well, we've changed our minds on some things. Well, Christians have changed their minds. God has always rooted moral teaching specifically in the way he made the world. And sexual teaching, because it has to do with humans, is deeply rooted in the way that he made human beings, male and female, the potential for procreation and all that sort of stuff. You just look at Matthew 19, he answers a question about divorce by going back to the garden. And this is something that we've got to do to teach our kids. We got to start there. And by the way, we got to start earlier. If you're waiting for the conversation to come up, the culture has already deeply had a conversation, sometimes not even out loud. We often say around the Colson Center that the most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones argued, but the ones that are assumed. And you just think about kind of the live action Beauty and the Beast from a couple years ago, or you think about kind of the funny characters who are just a little bit gay, the lead actors in sitcoms and so on. And what you have now is a normalization where it inculcates before we even have the conversation that lifestyle is actually normal. I think we got to start early. I think we got to go back to creation.
Well, you can, John, ask a question that relates very directly to that, and I'm going to go ahead and skip to it now because I know it's what you've been talking about, and also it gives you an opportunity to maybe say a little bit more about what has become, I think, a passion of yours, and that is the idea of a biblical anthropology that we do pretty well when it comes to, if you say to Christians we should study God, most Christians are not going to argue with that. But when you say to Christians that we need to have a biblical understanding of humanity, that sometimes is not an easy dot to connect. But Ken specifically says that culture is now defining personhood in a way to discard the significance of being human. And is that addressed in the new book? And do you have any more to say about that?
Yeah, in fact, you can't understand life, marriage, and religious liberty without understanding what it means to be human. So in each of those topics, it starts with a biblical anthropology and why this stuff matters. And Ken, you said Ken, I think was his name, Warren, is exactly right. I mean, exactly right. I think it's stunning, for example, that if you go to the great creeds of Christendom, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, or whatever, never once is there a statement there about, and this is what we believe about human beings. And the reason is because these creeds and Christian doctrine were almost always a reaction to a cultural lie. In other words, it didn't kind of occur like we need to be clear on this, until Marcion starts cutting up the canon. Like we need to know which books count and which books are Gnostic, and how do we make these decisions? It didn't occur to say, no, we believe Jesus is fully God and fully man, and still Arius started fooling around with that stuff, right? So this is where we're at culturally. And that should tell us two things. Number one is there wasn't really, among Christians especially, a disagreement about what it means to be human, whether in kind of the fundamental belief or the sexual expression and marriage expression of this. I mean, it was just unthought of. It just wasn't part of the radar. I mean, this did not happen until yesterday. And so now we're at a point as the church where we've got to join the rest of the church throughout history and get really clear on biblical anthropology. Because, again, if we don't have this conversation with the next generation, with our kids, with our own people in our own pews, the culture will, and it is. And that conversation will be over before we even get in.
Yeah. Eric asked a really interesting question that I think sort of indicates just how closely he's been listening to some of the things that you said, John. We talk about politics being downstream from culture, and yet we also say that laws do teach the culture certain things. So there's a little bit of a both and, a little bit of, as you say, sometimes we've got to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. But Eric asked the question this way: how do we balance our attempts to champion these critical issues through the political process with the danger of placing too much trust in the state? Do we risk abrogating our responsibilities as believers and as churches by relying on the state and focusing our attention on politics and lawmaking?
Yes, and we risk abdicating an area that God is still ultimately over if we stay out of politics too. And there's no other answer except we got to do both. We got to be able to walk and chew gum. And I think part of it is the ability to understand the political process and all the consequences of that, right? When you and I say around the Colson Center, look, elections matter, because a single election never comes with just one figure, one senator, one president, or whatever. It comes with a whole set of ideas, a whole set of policies, and a whole bunch of other people, sometimes that embed themselves deeply and make decisions. And but all these people are making decisions about society, about how we live life together, about what we think is important, about how we prioritize, and so on. And so the reason we got to care, it cannot be, and I think this is maybe at the root of where we go awry, is that if we think then we are going to change culture through politics because the way to do it is through power, then that's the first step off the bus, right? I mean, that's the first, wrong turn that takes us into the wilderness of captivity. If, however, we realize that politics is one way, an important way, that we can love our neighbors, and that if we care about our neighbors, we need to care about the society that they live in and the laws that are telling them what's true or what's lying. I mean, look, we've got a law being kicked around here in Colorado in which a transgender individual can request to get a new birth certificate. Now, we could roll our eyes and say that's just dumb because we disagree with transgender ideology, but it's even more than that. What we can do is actually say, we don't want our government to lie. We don't want our government to actually intentionally and under the guise of a false legality falsify documents, which is exactly what that would be, right? And that we don't want to live in a society where the government can falsify documents. That would be enough of a reason in and of itself. Not to mention, it's not a loving thing to do. So we got to love our neighbors. It's kind of like Bonhoeffer, right? When you think about those, if somebody was going to follow Jesus in the middle of what was happening with Nazi Germany, yeah, you should love your neighbor by saying hello to your Jewish neighbor when everybody else isn't, maybe inviting them over to dinner. But don't you think we should do something about the people that are throwing them into cattle cars and taking them off to be burned to death? The answer is yes. We got to do both.
John, Penny asked a question about the schools, and because that's where a lot of the current thinking starts with our kids, especially. How do we manage to teach our children godly views when even our schools are allowed legally to present transgender theology? And I think that this is an important question, probably as parents, but also as a Christian teacher who might be forced to teach some of these ideas against their own conscience. You have any thoughts about that?
Well, it's another example of why politics matters, right? Because the sex education curriculum comes to the state and the Department of Education, and if you sit it out, then that's the way that it goes. The one way that it goes forward. I think it also, as you said, it affects teachers and superintendents and administrators and whatever that follow Jesus. And we've been saying around the Colson Center for a long time. Again, the Manhattan Declaration draws the line. We can't cross this line. If you draw that line as a teacher, you might need a theology of getting fired, and that's what we've talked about. And that's hard. And by the way, you don't just need a theology of getting fired. The church that you're part of needs a theology of getting fired. And what I mean by that is, I think in this new day and age, when Caesar's claiming so much of what belongs to God, that Christians are going to have to be willing not only to say, I can't cross here in my conscience, but I can't. If you force me to choose, this is the right choice. And then you know what needs to happen? There needs to be an awful lot of people that come around and provide financial assistance, healthcare assistance, childcare, transportation. When you have a devastating loss because of a natural disaster, a fire, an accident, then Christians usually do that. We need to do that when there's a devastating loss because someone actually just decided to do the right thing. And this is what we've seen throughout the church, in the church throughout history. Now, Penny's question goes to a lot of other things. It's getting harder and harder and harder to say our kids should be in that environment where that level of indoctrination takes place. Now, I will say on the flip side, if the answer to you is don't engage with the issue, I want to protect my kids from ever talking about it, you're going to lose your kids because you need to be a part of the conversation with them. The problem is at a state-run school, you're often not a part of it until later, and that depends on the kid. That's a hard one to wrestle with. If you're not part of the conversation, then it's devastating. And one of the most devastating things about the legislation that we see come out, for example, in California, and they kicked it around in Colorado and then just punted it, they gutted it a little bit, which is good. And that's because people, by the way, stood up and came out, including people who didn't even have their kids in homes in public schools. And they fought it, and they were able to gut the legislation that passed here. But in California, in Orange County, you can opt your kid out of the discussions about homosexual acts. In other words, when they start talking about the mechanics of homosexual behavior, you can choose to opt your kids out of that. But when it comes to discussions of gender identity, it's in the law. You can't opt your kids out of that, wow. Which is a stunning part of the legislation. But it is. We talked about it on Breakpoint a little bit ago. Now, this is a long answer, Warren, but hang with me. Sure. I think we've desperately got to consider, how to best educate our kids. And again, theology of getting fired, theology of whatever, it's not worth losing your kid's soul in any sort of context. I also think that the church needs to take this really seriously because there are individuals in our congregations who, because of financial reasons, single moms, I think of the single mom in an inner city situation, desperately poor in a terrible school. So they're kind of stuck. This was one of the things that tore at Chuck's heartstrings right before he died, is how do we help those families get a better education? He wasn't even thinking about this. It was just they get a lousy education. Now they get a lousy education with all kinds of junk attached to it. And again, this is a way we've got to love our neighbors, politically standing up, showing up at the courthouse, showing up at the state house, and also caring for those who are going to be the victims of this.
John, William, I'm going to pivot a little bit in our conversation. We spent so much time on sexuality issues and religious liberty. I want to pivot a little bit to the life issue. William asked a question about the Alive from New York event that took place this past weekend that you and I have written about and other of the Breakpoint writers have written about. John, we talk almost on a weekly basis about developments at the state level around the life issue. Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia signed a heartbeat bill this week. I think he's the fourth governor to sign a heartbeat bill within the last few months. It looks like that on the life issue, as opposed to the marriage and religious liberty issue, we might be making some progress. First of all, is that an accurate assessment? And can you say more about sort of the movement for life in this country?
Yeah, we're making progress, but there's a real danger here. I don't know if anybody else follows the NBA playoffs, but I think it was the first round that the Golden State Warriors were playing against, and I can't even remember the team. But they were up by 35 at halftime. And what did they do? We've seen this all the time, right? I usually don't see an NBA playoff game, but that was one of the crazy parts of the story. But they were literally up 35-ish, I think, at halftime. And what did they do in the third quarter? What do you think, Warren? What did they do?
They collapsed.
They didn't collapse. And that's not what happens. When you're up 35, you don't collapse. When you're up 35, you take your foot off the gas and you start coasting. And you just start saying, well, we've been hitting shots, so we're going to continue to hit shots. Now, you like how I brought the NBA playoffs in this answer, don't you? I can see you're like grinning of disdain. Here's what I'm talking about. I think that there's a real danger here. Is there momentum? It's undoubtable. I think God has moved and changed hearts. He's changed minds. He gave the gift to us of the ultrasound movement, and there's a danger of taking your foot off the gas and thinking Trump's going to solve this or Trump's judges are going to solve this. All right, let me just be as clear as possible. we've got both legal and cultural barriers to ever seeing this thing finish out. But let's start with legal. Now, to be clear, as many people have said, and I'm just quoting here, and I didn't come up with this, the goal is not that we merely see abortion become illegal. The goal is that it becomes unthinkable. But we've got legal barriers before we get there. And the legal barrier is that the Supreme Court is very, very reticent to turn around and say we were completely wrong. The Supreme Court under John Roberts is very, very reticent, in my mind, to do anything sweeping like they did with Obergefell, or like even with Obergefell, they came back the very next year and gave Jack Phillips a whole lot of room. So this is just something that they're reticent to do. So when we say we could see Roe overturned, that's what these heartbeat bills, by the way, are designed to do. They're designed to be Supreme Court challenges. What's going to happen? Do I pray that God gives us a sweeping decision that when it goes from abortion's legal to abortion's illegal? Yeah, I actually do. But I think what happens is they're going to go back to the technicalities and say this never should have been a federal right. It's a constitutional it's constitutionally given to the states. We're going to punt it back to the states. And by the way, must not be the only one that thinks that. And of course, we've talked about this around the Colson Center. We all agree on this. And we're seeing states double down. That's why we see these heartbeat bills on one side, and why we see high-fiving New York politicians on the other side, is that they are locking in rights. Illinois, there was a really remarkable NPR podcast talking about the difference between Illinois and Missouri. You're talking about here, Missouri will be one of those that bans abortion. Illinois will be one of those that has abortion at any time for any reason. So that's the legal thing. We're not going to get a sweeping decision. So it's not over. It means now we've got to turn on the gas. If we live in California, if we live in Alabama, if we live wherever, we got to turn the gas on our own states and not coast in the third quarter. And I'm not even sure we're in the third quarter. It might just be the end of the first quarter, for the record. The second thing I would say, though, is culturally. And I've said this for a long time. And as this younger generation grows up, the thing that's been said about this younger generation that was untrue, that's proven untrue, is that they're all pro-choice. There is a remarkable group of young pro-lifers who see this as a justice issue. Many of them are liberal politically, but they just can't stomach this personally. But that's the key. It's personal. Statistics tell us that they're more pro-life than their parents were, but more likely to drive their friends to an abortion clinic if they need help. So how on earth does that make sense? Easy. All the things that we're talking about right now are being done in the cultural water of relativism. Relativism is the water in which we swim. There's a difference between saying something's wrong and saying something's wrong for me, but not for you. And until we get over that this is actually wrong, like slavery was wrong, like this becomes unthinkable, like slavery became unthinkable, then it's going to be really, really hard to see kind of a mission accomplished banner hanging anytime soon on this. So yeah, progress, absolutely. A line from New York was great. I think when you see a ranting Pennsylvania state congressperson assault, kind of accosting young girls, he's a nut, right? You're kind of seeing an unhinged. And I don't want to nut pick him. It would be kind of a nut picking if it was just him. But what he's seeing, we hear from Samantha Bee, on her television show, and Seth Meyers, and we hear on NPR, this sort of ranting of, can you believe he's crazy? Most people aren't there. And so that's good news. But man, we are not even in the fourth quarter.
Yeah. Well, John, unfortunately, we are in the fourth quarter of our time together, and so as we attempt to
I see what you did there. That was clever. I see what you did there. That was great. Yeah, well done.
Thank you very much. As we are attempting to, or as the clock is winding down on us, I want to pivot to a couple of questions related to what can we do and what do we do next. Logan and Pamela both asked similar questions. Logan first, what are the best resources for thinking Christians about bioethics, specifically regarding the nuances of surrogacy and transhuman integration? It's a little bit specialized, but I think if we focus on the best resources, some next steps, and maybe just some off the top of your head. And Pamela asked a similar question. What is the most effective way for an average person to get involved practically to support the Manhattan Declaration in our culture? What would be some first steps or baby steps for those in our position. And let's, of course, stipulate for the record that getting a copy of this book should be at the top of that list. But other than that, John, what do you have in mind?
Well, the bioethics question is huge. I'm glad it came up. It's part of the life issue. It's not even fringe anymore, particularly with reproductive technologies. So in the attempt to remake life in our own image, life is being lost. You think about through a typical IVF procedure, although it can be done differently, and some would say ethically, but a typical IVF procedure ends up killing a whole lot of embryos, or at least relegating embryos to be a frozen state into in a freezer. These are things that many Christians don't talk about. So one of the first things we can do is actually, when you do premarital counseling, just like you talk about, what do you guys think about money? What do you guys think about sex? And what do you guys think about, each other's moms? You need to ask, what do you think about artificial? Like if you struggle with infertility, what do you think about this? And there needs to be clear moral training. There's a lot of books. Without just kind of rattling them all off, I would say a couple things. Number one, follow Breakpoint, because we're always translating some of these arguments. We've talked about surrogacy a lot. We've talked about IVF a lot. We've talked about cloning. We've talked about CRISPR. We've talked about all these things a lot. So that's one way to kind of keep up to date with the big names. Some of the people that talk about this all the time, let me just give you names to follow. They've all got books out there. Nigel Cameron is one of them. Ben Mitchell is another one that's got a book out there. Gil Mylander has got a book out there. There was just a really powerful article written by Andrew Walker, who's a contributor to the book, and Matthew Lee Anderson, specifically on the ethical issues surrounding in vitro fertilization. It offended a lot of people, but you've got to take what they're saying, I think, really seriously. So there's all of that. I might have I think I've got a specific book on my shelf right behind me, but without turning around and finding it, those are the names you need to track and to follow. What was the second question was, how do you support the Manhattan Declaration? Is that right?
Yeah. What would be a next step or a baby step, other than educating ourselves, which you've given us some great advice on how to do that, that we could actually do? And I guess signing the Manhattan Declaration would be a good step if you haven't already done so.
That's the first step. Sign the Manhattan Declaration. Read the Manhattan Declaration and learn from it. Secondly, go read the Statement for Life that was part of the Focus on the Family Project of a Life of New York, because that actually was not only a statement of here's what I think about life, it was a statement of here's what I'm going to do about it. And it gives you a number of steps. What should you do about it? First, teach your kids. Don't assume your kids are going to get through osmosis your views on life, marriage, and religious liberty, or especially Christian views on life and marriage. They'll get views from osmosis, but just not from you. Please intentionally start with creation and make these sort of applications. We got to change the hearts and minds of the next generation. Third, get behind organizations that are doing these things. For example, those that are actually helping people think about their views on life, marriage, and religious liberty, like the Colson Center. Get behind groups like Focus on the Family. Get behind groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom, who day in and day out are for free defending people who are facing discrimination to light persecution because of their beliefs. And we certainly need to stand up for our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world through groups like Open Doors and the World Watch List and so on and so on and so on. And also, this is what Johnny Erickson Tata has said a number of times. Chuck used to call it over the backyard fence around the barbecue grill. Johnny Erickson Tata always says at Starbucks. In other words, we have the tendency to shrink from these conversations in public. And I think it's because we're not confident. I think it's because we fear the social cost. This creates what's called the spiral of silence. This is what Chuck was talking about when he collapsed and ultimately died during from the collapse during that speech. That if people don't speak up, fewer people will speak up. So it sounds crazy, but one of the most important things you can do to amplify the conversation is just use your own voice. Because not only does that add to the noise, but it also adds another voice and another voice and another voice. Somebody else says, well, I can say that. I can say that. And look, if you don't know how to talk about these things, it's not because the answers aren't there. This is the golden age of answers, especially on cultural issues. Christians have thought through this. They've provided it. There's even talking points. Learn them. Use them. Don't be coward into silence. It's what my friend Mike Miller calls cocktail party pressure. The subject comes up. Everyone agrees. You're the only one. If I say something, I won't get invited back. Well, we need a theology of not getting invited back, and maybe a theology of of getting fired. This is just the cost. This isn't a surprise. This is what Christians have always dealt with. This is part of the game, right? And so you do it because it's a way to follow Jesus, love God, and love your neighbor.
Well, John, that is a great answer, and I'm going to just push on one part of that answer, because Cynthia observes that she thinks that pastors in particular have been more silent on this issue. So all the same advice applies to pastors as well, I would assume, but any additional word for pastors who might be watching and listening today?
Oh, absolutely. It absolutely applies the same. And I just got a notice that said my connection was lost. So I don't know if you can still see me or not. You're frozen on my screen, so I don't know if it's me or you, but hopefully people can still hear me.
We can,
okay,
John. We can still hear you just fine. Yep.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. It does. Now, I would say that pastors have a very, very hard job. And one of the best ways you can support your pastor and encourage him to have the sort of courage to talk about these sort of things is when he does, support him. Because when he does, he'll get hammered that he's not being nice enough, that he's not being kind enough, that he's not being sensitive enough, that he's focusing on politics and not enough of the other stuff or whatever. And if he knows that there's a group of people that will support him and encourage him to teach the whole counsel of the Word of God and what that means for us to live in this cultural moment from grace and truth, then he'll be much, much, much more likely to step up. But if he feels like he's all alone, then it's going to be really, really hard. Now, it might be a theological problem. It might just be, a self-preservation problem. So we're going to have to show him the support. And then also, there are events, there are programs. Right now, we're taking applications to study with us for the next year. We have a lot of pastors in that program. We have a lot of business leaders and doctors. You probably have heard about it. We call it the Colson Fellows Program. Next weekend in D.C., we'll commission 234 people who have studied with us and are now being immobilized into cultural leadership, many of them around these three issues of life, marriage, and religious liberty. We try to connect the cultural need with people's giftedness, calling, and placement. So that's happening right now. And one of the things you could do is encourage your pastor to consider studying with us for a year. Send them to the Wilberforce Weekend or other training events. There's other groups that do really amazing events around these issues. Summit Ministries and others. So anyway, I would encourage you then to kind of put your money where your mouth is. It's easy to condemn our pastors. Why don't they ever talk about this stuff? Help them, help get behind them. Help them, send them articles, forward them breakpoints. There's lots of ways I think that we can encourage. Doesn't mean it's going to work, but there is a place to start at least.
Yeah, well, John, that's great advice. And since you mentioned the Colson Fellows Program, that's a nice transition into sort of some closing announcements that I need to make, because we are within just a couple of minutes of the top of the hour and we need to bring this time to a close. But first of all, John, let me just say thank you for this book. It's very nourishing, a blue chip group of scholars and activists, as we've already identified, that are part of it. Thank you and David Dockery for your diligence in bringing this group together and for producing a book that is not only helpful, but I should add it's beautiful as well. It's a nice hardback book, and I'm a word guy, I'm a print guy, so I love a beautifully crafted book, and this one is that as well. John also mentioned our Colson Fellows Program. We are going to have an informational webinar. This format that we're on right now, it'll be online, it'll be video. That's going to take place on May 21st at 8:00 p.m. Eastern Time. If you'd like to know about how you could participate in that webinar, you could just watch and learn more about our Colson Fellows Program. Again, go to breakpoint.org, or we have a special website for our fellows, which is colsonfellows.com. You can go to colsonfellows.com and find out more about the Colson Fellows Program. And just by the way, I should mention, we've mentioned Alliance Defending Freedom a couple of times, more than a couple of times in the last hour. Kristen Wagoner, who is an Alliance Defending Freedom attorney, who argued the Jack Phillips Masterpiece Cake Shop case before the United States Supreme Court, is one of our Colson Fellows. She graduated from that program, gosh, I think more than a dozen years ago, wasn't it, John? And she's put her worldview training to good use since then, without doubt. And finally, let me just mention that we want you to have your own copy of this book. The book is Life, Marriage, and Religious Liberty, What Belongs to God, What Belongs to Caesar, edited by David Dockery and John Stonestreet. And in order to get that copy, all you have to do is go to breakpoint.org and click on one of the two banners that you'll see on the page that says Join the Defense of Truth. So in answer to a couple of the questions that we had, how to get started, that's a great way. Sign the Manhattan Declaration, get a copy of this book, read this book, and be better prepared and equipped to answer questions related to life, marriage, and religious liberty with your family, friends, and those in your sphere of influence. And the final thing I'd like to mention before I give John the last word is that we will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who signed up for today's webinar. It'll have a link to a recording of this last hour that you can watch again or share with your family and friends. And we encourage you actively to share. We want to be open-handed about this information, so please feel free to share it with those in your sphere of influence. It'll also have links to some of the other resources that we've talked about during the past hour. So I think that's it for all the housekeeping items. John, do you have a final word for us before we go?
No, Warren, I want to say thanks, and thanks to everybody who joined the webinar today. And God bless you guys as you do what you can to make sure that our lines are all drawn in the right places. This is a kind of prerequisite to living faithfully in today's culture, and it's always encouraging when people want to join in that cause. And so Godspeed to everybody.
Amen. God bless you. Thank you, John. Thanks to everybody for being with us today. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye.